One of the persistent challenges of constitutional order generally is this fundamental question of how do you balance the interest of the community versus the interests of individuals. That plays out in lots of contexts, but it plays out particularly in these contexts of emergencies, including public health crises of various sorts, in which the needs of the community might be extremely high and the burdens imposed on individuals might also be very high. Individual people and property owners have traditionally not been understood to have a right to put others at risk of catching a dangerous disease, and thus their liberties could be restricted so as to abate the risk to others. Individuals could be subjected to mandatory testing and quarantine. Property could be destroyed without compensation. The procedural protections that individuals might have before action was taken against their freedom or their property in such situations has historically been fairly limited, given the exigent nature of the threat raised by pandemics or epidemics across the nation's history. The Constitution does not carve out exceptions for other kinds of rights people might have in the context of emergencies. Instead, we have traditionally recognized that all the rights that Americans have are qualified to some degree. They operate within certain conditions. There are circumstances in which the public need might override particular interest of individuals, and we've understood those to be implicit in the contours of the particular constitutional liberties that are given to individuals, rather than being a separate provision that gets triggered in the case of an emergency. Traditionally inherited from the common law and then built into American constitutional law was an assumption that in these extreme circumstances, the needs of the community tend to override the interests of individuals. Much more difficult to think about the current situation in this context in which we are preemptively shutting down the economy much more generally. We're restricting liberty very widely for a long and indeterminate period of time. Much harder to know how to balance the interests of the community in that context against the interests of the particular individuals who are being affected by these kinds of lockdown orders. And so this puts real pressure on the kinds of traditional doctrines courts have used in thinking about how to balance the interest of individuals against the community, because here the kinds of impacts on individuals and individual liberty are very extensive, and the kinds of benefits the community is going to see from those are somewhat speculative. So one concern about these kinds of public health emergencies, including the current pandemic, is not only how aggressive and interventionist is the government in the midst of the crisis in trying to respond to this crisis, but also how active and interventionist is the government going to be after the crisis is over and we've passed through this immediate pandemic and we're trying to think ahead.